My name is Warner Lord. With me is Phil Costello, bon vivant, longtime resident of Madison, former town attorney. We're going to continue our discussions of Phil's version of the modern history of Madison. We started last time briefly with the 50s and got a little bit into the 60s. I think this time we're going to deal more detail with the 60s and some of the events that shaped Madison as we know it, and the various personalities who helped move those things along. I thought I'd start by giving you just a quick recap of the 60s. This was a time of incredible change. The decade started with a population of about 4,500 people. By the time the decade was over, there were over 9,000 people in town. The schools had a population of 1,000 beginning of the 60s, and at the end of the 60s, 2,400. Well, things are doubling in town. 64 new roads were added in town. There were 140 subdivision approvals in the decade. The town budget in 1960 was about $250,000. By the end of the decade, it was almost $1 million. That's a fourfold increase in the budget. Schools' budget was just over $500,000 in 1960. It was almost $2 million at the end of the 60s. A lot went on in town. Cops Road School needed an addition in the 60s. A new high school was built and opened. The first graduating class in 1961 was 53 students. The Ryerson School was built in the 60s. The Brown School was planned and ready for construction by the end of the 60s. We needed an addition to Daniel Hand High, incidentally adding an auditorium because we hadn't put one in the original building. The library expanded. The Beach and Recreation Commission was formed. The town formed a conservation commission in the 60s to deal with environmental issues. The land trust was formed, began operation in the 60s. The town decided it needed a charter at the end of the 60s, and that was being worked on. Pension plans for town employees came in the 60s. Town converted to the uniform fiscal year, which caused some problems you may hear about. We had to buy new landfill because we filled up the old dump. And as we discussed in our last show, we purchased the Garvin property and the Surf Club property. And the decade ended with a political trauma of sorts. After years of Republican domination of politics, a Democrat was elected at the end of the decade and brought us into the 70s. So you get some sense of what was going on in the 60s. Now I think it's Phil's turn to regale us with some good stories of those times.
Well, there certainly were a lot of good times. I've listed a number of names of people that were prominent in Madison, both politically and socially, and I thought I'd just use those to kick off my part of the discussion. The 60s saw the end of Bob Cairns' 16 years as our state representative in Hartford. He almost got to be Speaker of the House up there, and at the same time he was doing a great deal to preserve the country club. And as we purchased the Garvin property, we were able to add, in addition to the land we bought from the Hollingsworth estate, almost all of the course, which previously had been leased. So the beautiful golf course that we have today, I attribute to Bob Cairns and his planning. A name Ned Call may ring a bell with a number of you. Ned was always haunting our beaches, suggesting that we should have public access from all over the state to our town beach. Now, our town beach was carefully paid for just by Madison people, Madison taxes, and so we argued if they could use Hammonasset, it was plenty big, bigger than our beach. And finally, some citizens from New Haven brought a lawsuit, which I was designated to defend, and the court ruled that Madison could maintain its beach for its own citizens and their guests. So I was proud of that decision, but it still operates more or less that way today, even though the federal courts have broadened the scope of public access. Lowell Weicker was a frequent visitor to Madison during the 60s, at the end of which he assumed more and more power in the state. Bill Lodge was an advocate for the taxpayer groups. Tom Meskel had a summer home in Madison, and by the end of the 60s, he was elected governor of the state of Connecticut. But we used to see him a lot in the summertime. John Bailey, who was a national power in the Democratic Party, had a summer home in Madison, and he used to come to all of the Democratic cocktail parties down at Jack Davis's home overlooking Long Island Sound. And they had some huge parties in those days because the Republicans all went. It was such a good party that I can remember going almost every year. And you got to meet the people who are actually running the state, because up in Hartford, the Democrats were running the state. And the Bailey family has been a contributor to Madison for many, many years. Jack Davis ran the Grove School and did a great job of it. I just met a young man who had his graduation certificate while I was donating my blood this morning. And this fellow sat next to me with a big Grove School graduation certificate. But Jack did a lot of good for the town and contributed a lot of good thoughts. He was one of those voted outstanding Madison Person of the Year by the JCs. And tonight, ironically, the 28th of June, or no, what is it, May? April, okay. My mind doesn't wander too far. We are having the award dinner to announce this year's Citizen of the Year. And I don't know who the winner is, although I did vote in the vote that was taken, so I'll find out tonight. Betty Hudson was very active in the League of Women Voters and in Democratic politics in Madison. And she and I later clashed in the middle 70s for elections. And I'll tell you more about that later. Linda Emmons began her 16-year legislative term in the mid-60s. And so she and Bob Cairns are tied for 8 terms in the legislature. Today, Peter Metz is our representative, as many of you know. Henry Cooney is a name that stands out to me. He was chairman of the Republican Town Committee, and during the years when I was state central committee person, Henry was our political leader. And he didn't really look like one or sound like one. He'd say, I gotta tell you, this is the way it should go. But it went pretty well for him until 1969. And I'll tell you, we'll both tell you more about that later, the great adoption of the charter, which was a major event that Leo Bonoff, our town clerk, was chosen chairman of the Charter Commission, which was half Republican, half Democrat, and they worked on it, and the big issue was whether we should have 5 selectmen or 3. Of course, for years we'd operated with 3. And the League of Women Voters decided that we should have 5. It was newly formed. It was in its maiden voyage in the 60s, and by the end of the 60s, they were quite powerful in town. And the votes that were taken on the charter resulted in a 5-member Board of Selectmen. And we had to elect 2 additional selectmen in 1970 to fill out the board. But the funny part of the whole thing was I was representing the existing Board of Selectmen, the continuation of the 3-man Board of Selectmen, and we went to the final meeting of the Charter Commission, and Bob Adams finally persuaded them to go back to 3. And they all agreed that they would, and there wouldn't be any more argument about it. And Bob, stubborn as he could be, and he wasn't feeling well in those days, said, I'm not leaving this meeting until you vote. Well, Leo said, I move we adjourn the meeting. And it went back to 5. And as we walked out the door, I said, you know, Bob, I think you just blew it. And he says, I think you're right. But that's how Madison wound up with a 5-member Board of Selectmen. They function fairly well, although the amount of paperwork downtown is about twice as much to keep in touch with 5 selectmen as it is to keep in touch with three, which couldn't have previously had been done by phone, mostly. George McManus became involved in town and challenged John Murphy for probate judge. Ella Grasso was a frequent visitor here. That's more in the 70s, and I'll get onto that perhaps some later programs. Governor O'Neill used to come down and visit, and Joe McKenzie, who's in the news these days, was our Republican National Committee woman for the last 14 years, and she ran a restaurant in Ivoryton and was a great restaurateur, and we'll leave that to a later program, but she was quite an amazing lady and is now fighting for her survival on a national level. Don LaChance, starting out with being chairman of the March of Dimes and JC, and he was JC Man of the Year in the early 60s. He began to become more political. He became chairman of the Democratic Town Committee, and Donald eventually was elected for selectman in the 70s, but, or was it the 80s? It might have been the 80s. But his power as a leader in town grew, and he and I shared the same office space on Wall Street, 16 Wall Street, on the second floor. We had the same waiting room, and then he did his optometry practice on one side, including my glasses, and he always made them so I couldn't see too well, because we were opponents in softball, but I forgave him, and we're still good friends. And he lives up in New Hampshire now and comes down to visit his sons on the shoreline here. Angie Schmidt, I have her name. Her husband was a great leader in town, and he was a fire chief for many years, and he used to stop at Nick's restaurant for a drink every morning at 11 o'clock. So I would stop over there at 11 and have a drink with him. He always drank a shot and a beer, and I would have whatever I was drinking at the time. But I learned more town politics from Joe Schmidt and Angie, I should say, than I think I did from my fellow Republicans. And the Schmidt family certainly played a major role in Democratic politics. We had our politicians' balls, which are in the early 70s, but they were an outcome of some hard feelings that developed during the 60s, and so we anonymously ran a politicians' ball at the VFW, was American Legion Hall, and sent all the invitations without anyone knowing who was running it. And everybody showed up. Both town committees were there. They had a wonderful time, and for 5 years, that was a tradition I'd like to see them do statewide. It worked quite well. It didn't seem to change politics too much, but at least everybody knew who everybody was. Abigail Farron, who's helping us with the production of the show, she became a selectman as a result of the new charter, and I'll tell you a story about that later. Howard Hopkins became our first Democrat, first selectman. I don't know if you mentioned his name, but Howard had been selected to be an enumerator, and that's when the town houses all were given numbers. So Howard, and the Republicans were pretty naive, I think, to put him out there. He walked to almost every home in Madison, talked to the people. He's a very likable guy, and he got to know them all. So when he came up to run for first selectman, the whole town knew him and liked him, and he won. But that's not the only reason. But Howard was a nice guy, and I worked with him, and I must admit, all the Democratic selectmen, Don LaChance later, were extremely pro-Madison and good people. Willard Hathaway was the first. We thought Charlie Blatchley represented North Madison, but he never talked about it much. But Willard sort of got on the Board of Selectmen later on as a representative of North Madison. And we see him frequently nowadays. He's living up in New Hampshire. And my last and perhaps favorite was Franklin Bauer. And everybody in town knows Franklin. He's retired. But one speech I gave once to the Rotary Club, and Franklin was a member, I said, I'd like to recognize Franklin Bauer, who saved my marriage 2 out of 3 times. He wasn't my minister. I'm Catholic, and my wife was an Episcopalian. So we didn't know who to go to for marriage counseling, so we picked Franklin. And he did extend our marriage probably for 10 years. And I talked to my ex-wife yesterday, and she said to say hello to everybody in Madison, including Franklin Bauer.
Well, you mentioned the charter, which seems to be a pretty significant event for this town. You might talk about that a little bit, the process that we went through.
Right. Well, it was by state law you can set up a charter commission, and we did that, and it had 9 members. I think there were 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats, with Leo Bonoff as chairman. And they wrestled with all of the town agencies, which ones to put into the charter, which ones to abolish because they were not active. And there was a big fight because a lot of people didn't want to see 5-member Board of Selectmen. And the question of whether the charter would be voted on at the town election of '69 became quite a public issue. But finally the selectmen agreed that they would allow it to go for a vote, and they couldn't put in the option of 3 or 5 selectmen, so they went in with the Charter Commission's recommendation of 5. And once the charter was adopted, then that was like our Constitution for the town of Madison. It hasn't been amended to any great degree. They talk about it occasionally, whether the police commission should be elected or appointed, and today the police commission is the hot seat in town. But back in those days it was much quieter. The chief of police's pension was interesting because he had been promised by his friends on the Republican town committee they would support it, and he sat outside the window. Did I say anything about this last time?
That's a good story. Tell it.
Yeah, I'll tell it again. But he listened through the window, and they voted unanimously against a police pension. And this was in the late 50s when I was not town council, and I worked for the police department as their lawyer, and we got it through by 14 votes. So the police, when they get rambunctious nowadays, they can remember their entire pension depended on 14 votes. A lot of good people on both sides of that one.
Well, then the pension plan for the town employees came in.
Right.
In the 60s also. Now, was it separate from the police pension?
Yes, and it passed by a fairly small majority, as I recall. I didn't get involved too much in that, but it certainly did come in, and of course now it's a pretty important thing for the town to have a pension for all town employees. It's an expensive item in our budget, and I think our town is not unionized at the present time. I think to a large degree because of that pension. But now they occasionally talk about it, and of course the cities that have unions have much bigger pension plans than we have. But it's part of the town law, no doubt about that.
Now, it was at this period, as I recall, toward the end of the 60s, that the town made a decision to go to the uniform fiscal year.
Yes, I think the legislature began to pressure all the small towns to adopt the uniform fiscal year, which we have today, but we had to vote to do it. It was a 2-month change from September 1 to October 1. And that was controversial, but ironically, it led to the defeat of Howard Hopkins when he ran for a second term as first selectman. I don't know that anybody was aware of the fact, but we had to send out 3 tax bills in the year of the changeover. And you know how much you love to get a tax bill from anybody. Well, the people of Madison resented getting 3 in 1 year under the reign of Howard Hopkins. So I think that probably cost him 100 votes, and he only lost by 48. So you can see how significant that was when his secretary challenged him for his own job. And we can talk more about it. But yeah, she beat him. And she, Vera Dallas, I'm talking about, and she turned out to be a popular selectman after she got into office. Is that enough about that? Or
That's enough about that. Were you at all involved in the whole aviation Griswold Airport?
Yes. The owner of the airport was a good friend of mine, Sherm Griswold, and I wanted to see the airport survive. I still would like to see it survive. The town selectmen voted to buy it back around 1990, but the Board of Finance killed it at that time. Nobody remembered it. I didn't either until I looked it up. But private airports are slowly going out of business. And in the future, I think they will become more important again as helicopters are perfected and small planes that can use shorter runways. So SHRM was interested in preserving the airport, and we got an aviation commission going in Madison. And a lot of guys put their planes over there, and it was thriving quite well until SHRM had some problems and did some things that frightened people away. And unfortunately, that led to the demise of the popularity of the airport. But it was very popular, and I took a few flights out of there that I happily remember. Now everybody's gone to Chester. The little airport up in New London, I understand, is gone now, and but the airport peaked in business, I think, during the 60s. And
then the town worked out an arrangement
Yes.
of abating taxes.
Right, and SHRM needed a paved runway. He couldn't afford it. He was not a wealthy man. As it turns out, his widow may be, but he wasn't himself. And so the town agreed to build a runway and lease it to him in lieu of his taxes. In other words, he would not have to pay taxes, and that would cover the cost of the runway. And that helped to build the airport into the successful small-town airport.
And of course, this was the time when the town acquired both the surf club and the Garden property. I think we pretty well covered that last time.
Yeah, from my point of view as a golfer, that allowed the golf course to consolidate all of the back nine, which had previously been owned by the Garvin family, and the town's original purchase. And then the golf club swapped land, which is now the football field, and those used to be golf holes, and we gave that to the town in lieu of some other land so that the consolidation of the golf course became effective, and the town got some land for parking and whatnot behind the town, behind the old club, which at one time was a country club, believe it or not, during the 50s and 40s, what is now the surf club.
Right, and so there was the beach club, and then there was the country club. So you had the waterfront was covered by the beach club.
Well, the Madison Beach Club is a separate private club,
Right.
but there was a beach club, mostly New Haven people, that rented what is now the surf club.
All right.
And they ran after maybe 10 years, I don't know exactly how long, until the town got into the act.
Well, I think we've rather well covered all of this, considering that the town was growing at such a furious rate. The population is increasing. The number of kids in the schools are increasing. We're building schools left and right, quite literally. New commissions, new concerns about environment. This is the time period where the town was really concerned about environment. Salt Meadow, Salt Marsh. This is how the land trust got started. Their first acquisitions were salt marsh. Very concerned about that. The Conservation Commission talking about preserving land, working with the land trust to some extent. And maybe this has set the stage rather nicely for the 70s, when the taxpayers began to say, we've had enough of this. Taxes are going up. We got 3 tax bills in 1 year. We're building schools. The town's indebtedness is rising at a furious rate. And the first referendum began to show up. Taxpayers saying, no, we're not going to vote on this at a meeting. We want a referendum. This is when this all started. I was looking through the town reports, and as I surveyed each year, the last thing at the annual meeting was budget approved, budget approved, budget approved. Because budgets were being approved very easily in the 60s. Not so in the 70s. There were some radical changes there. And you might give us a sort of a preview of what's beginning to happen as we turn over into the 70s and in the uniform fiscal year. We've got 5 selectmen, and the taxpayers are restless.
Well, the first thing, we needed 2 more selectmen. And the charter could not provide for them at the town election of '69. So we had a special election, I think in February of '70, and it was worked out between the two parties that Abigail Farron would be the Democratic nominee and Bob Walker would be the Republican, and there would be no other candidates muddying up the waters. But a rumor leaked out that apparently from the Cafe Lafayette, which also sprung up during the '60s, and by '70s it was a pretty busy place, that they were going to lead a write-in vote petition campaign for somebody that we didn't know. And when I came home from work on election day, Howard Hopkins grabbed me, called me, and said, "You and Don LaChance running this thing, I understand? How can you do this?" And I knew nothing about it. Well, to make a long story short, Pat Enright got 16 write-in votes, and that was the big uproar. But the other interesting side effect was that Gail Farron's group heard about it and got organized, and she got twice as many votes as the Republican. Do you remember exactly what it was, Gail?
I don't.
It was almost 2 to 1.
It was very.
Yeah. So that's how we got to 5 selectmen, and it was exciting. Pat Enright has since moved out to the West Coast, but he was a character of the '60s, '70s, '80s, and '90s.
Well, he was the owner of the
He bought the Woodlawn at one point for several years. He ran the Unicorn up in North Madison 10 years ago, and he was a golfer. So that's how I knew him. But the golf club, as I said, plays a role throughout this whole thing. And today they've just about bought all the land that's available, and I don't think they'll be expanding anymore. But the '70s, I remember going to a dinner party. No, it wasn't. It was a party at the wharf for Vera Dowles, the Women's Republican Club threw it, and I was the Toastmaster. And during my speech, I put my hand on Vera's head and said, "Whoever dreamed that under this head of hair was the next first selectman of Madison?" And everybody burst into laughter. I didn't know she wore a wig, but I found out very quickly that she did. That was one of the more humorous. She was a very straight-laced lady and very little humor. One time she thought she should record the selectmen's meeting, so she brought in one of those big circular tape recorders that had 2 reels slowly turning, and she said, "From now on we're going to record our meeting." No one spoke for the next half hour. We just sat there and watched it go around. Everyone was afraid to be recorded. Now they're all recorded and on TV and everything else, but that was culture shock for the politicians back in their first term.
Well, perhaps that's a good place for us to stop our session here. We've pretty well covered the 50s and 60s, where our purpose here is to give the citizens of Madison a sense of the path the town has been following from the 50s, the 60s, 70s, hopefully into the 80s and 90s. And our sense is that maybe things have changed, but not very much.
Except the population.
Except the population and physical aspects of the town. So until our next session, I'm Warner Lord.
I'm Phil Costello.
So long until tomorrow.
Bye-bye.